Hi, everybody. Good morning. Super excited to welcome my friend Sapna to talk about, I think, a really hard and heavy topic, which is how do we use a trauma-informed lens to manage for workplace equity, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. There are lots of terms to describe the work that we are doing and the outcomes that we want to achieve. And so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this because we have Sapna here. And Sapna, will you just start off with telling folks about you, like your background, your incredible history of like being an environmental educator? Yeah, all the things.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Aparna. I'm so excited and honored to be here. My name is Sapna Sapori. I use she, her pronouns. I'm calling in from Suquamish lands on the Kitsap Peninsula. I identify as cis hetero, able-bodied, light-skinned woman of color. First generation born in the States in an Indian American family. And for visual support, I have light brown skin, dark brown hair and eyes. Hair is in a braid. I'm wearing gold earrings and a green shirt. In my background, you'll see a daybed and lots of plants. And you also might hear two very barky dogs in the background. So preemptive apologies on that. And I currently work as a DEIJ consultant, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice consultant. But as you so kindly said before, I come from a background in education and in nonprofit administration, environmental ed. And I am a learner. I think my superpower is not being necessarily the expert in the work at hand, but rather translating that work so it's something that we can tangibly address in our classrooms used to be and workplaces now. So who I am not, really quick, I want to throw this out there. Who I am not is an expert on trauma, not a certified counselor. I'm a facilitator. I'm a learner. And I think coming to this space of learning from that deep body of work of trauma-informed practices, that is a really important posture that we need to have of humility and constant learning. So trying to learn from it and apply it, that's where I come in.
I love that because one of the things that I try and do for this half an hour every Monday morning is help people leave sort of the abstract spaces, right? A lot of the DEIJ work is very abstract, and sort of bring it down to earth so that we can do something about it, right? And get really clear about actions. As I, like you and I have been chatting about a lot of like cultural trauma, in the time that we've known each other professionally, we've been friends. I've been thinking about how little we actually both talk about or even acknowledge trauma in the workplaces with adults, but how little trauma informs how we shape workplaces. And I'm just curious, like, you've been an educator, you work with young people, and now you're working mostly with adults. What are some differences in like kind of even just your noticing of like trauma-informed approaches in the K-12 spaces and like now we're adults and I suppose we don't have it anymore?
I know, right? It's like you turn 18 and you're like fully baked and you're supposed to know everything there is to know. And then we wonder why, things go awry or we're in pain and we're not able to talk through our emotions because, to be honest, well-constructed, trauma-informed classrooms where you have practitioners, teachers that are working so hard to create psychologically safe spaces for children, where they have access to the tools that they need to support them on their communication. When we use your words, what are you feeling? What are you thinking? Let's describe it. And we only do that in elementary school at most sometimes, definitely in kindergarten, I hope, that those are the experiences. But then we expect ourselves to have that kind of understanding as adults when slowly over time we're not including that. It's kind of amazing to think that little Johnny more emotional intelligence than I do as an adult because it's not something that's accessible to me. Or if I know about it,
Yeah.
it's not something that's prioritized in my workplace for me to spend time on. So
Mm-hmm.
we have to confront, and this is where it, the trauma-informed workplaces, diversity, equity, inclusion, justice work, and then racialized capitalism all start to come together of like, well, why is it that we don't spend time understanding how to communicate? And instead it's don't ask questions, put your head down,
Mm-hmm.
power through all of that. Are we treating adults in the workplaces as humans, or are we treating them as cogs in a machine, but expecting human outcomes only to a certain extent as long as it doesn't interfere with the quote unquote immediate bottom line? So yeah, I think that's where I came into it, was like, wow, I have students that can, young children that can better articulate their emotions and needs
Mm-hmm.
than I've ever been supported to do it. And we wonder why it doesn't work. So one of the things that I want to just clarify really quickly is what is trauma. And
Yeah.
when we're using that word,
Mm-hmm.
I want to point out that we have trauma is the psychological and emotional response to distressing events,
Yeah.
right? And those distressing events and experiences can be very diverse. You can have big T trauma, like capital T trauma,
Yeah.
and you can also have little t trauma. And that is not to denote the importance or to legitimize one and delegitimize another or anything like that, but rather to clarify if one is coming from violence, war, death, these things that are very large scale versus the smaller, quote unquote, smaller, longer term layering pieces, housing,
Mm-hmm.
hunger, abuse, bullying, these kinds of things that layer over time. So, Aparna, you had mentioned adverse childhood experiences, and that idea
Yeah.
like we have these layering pieces that can inform who we are and how we function in a society in the future and with each other. Because trauma is inherently interpersonal, right? It feels like it's something that
Mm-hmm.
we experience, but because my brain and my body and my actions are all intertwined, it affects people around me and vice versa. So when we think about the workplace as an interpersonal, multiple interpersonal relationships, um,
Yeah.
we are bringing these pieces in, and the workplace itself can be sources of these big and little t traumas, right? Especially when we think about daily microaggressions, constant abuse, toxicity, um,
Mm-hmm.
gaslighting, these disenfranchisements of lived realities. I think we get into this space of why aren't we talking about it more and seeing how it influences when you and I are in the same room together and we're working on this widget.
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
how who we are, what we've experienced, what we're experiencing in this space together influences our ability to create said widget. And by the way, that's
Mm-hmm.
for many other people. So we're creating products for people without allowing ourselves to be human. It's weird.
Oh, we are creating products for people without considering their humanity. Like that's wild. Okay, so you mentioned adverse childhood experiences. For educators, we are really familiar with the ACEs or the ACE questionnaire.
Mhm.
It's used a lot, and it's specifically used with people that are under the age of 18,
Mhm.
right? And many of us have taken it multiple times as young people in a K-12 setting with our guidance counselor or a school psychologist, or right, maybe even our therapist. And um, it asks some really interesting questions. I do want to talk about like the race piece of trauma, because we know that that's very real and it's been studied. but I think ACEs extends across races, right? It wasn't really designed for any one racial group in mind or one gender in mind, but it asks a lot. It only asks about 10 questions, right? And it asks things that as adults, we are impacted by, but no one is asking us, right? No one, like when you start a new job, no one's implementing the adult version of an ACEs
Right.
questionnaire, right? And it's some of it's, things like, did you have a parent or an adult that swore at you, that insulted you, that humiliated you? Or did you grow up in a house where it was like common to yell, scream, throw things at the kids, or some like really hard things around like abuse. But other things that I think, you said big T trauma and little T trauma. One of the things that I remember about the questionnaire that really stood out to me was, did you grow up in a family where someone thought you were special or important?
Mhm.
And if you say no to that,
Mhm.
what kind of an adult do you turn into?
Mhm. Yeah, these are really great. And oh gosh, the ACE work, the work that we do, understanding how children learn, we need more of it. I'm just going to say that we always need more in education and support and resources for our education systems. And there's way more work in that right now than there is in kind of andragogy and like the adult education and adult learning and adult systems. Because again, who's allowed to be a human? Which
Mhm.
really intersects with race. So you mentioned ACE, and what I work with my clients to create is not necessarily workplaces where we're asking these things, like
Yeah.
you don't need to disclose these things. you know,
Right. Yeah.
it's do I have a real choice to bring my full self in, or do I have to assimilate into the culture of the
Mhm.
dominant power structure in this organization that forces me to be something different than who I actually am? And part of that is this background that I have with me, or the background that I'm experiencing in that space. If you took those ACE indicators and said, have I ever had a boss that abused me verbally? Have I ever had toxic
Yeah.
experiences with clients that are donors that were allowed to continue because they were paying for, our programs or whatever it is? These kinds of things that create or deconstruct a sense of psychological safety in the
Mhm.
organization that we work in. And as Catherine Manning talks about it in her great article, this idea of institutional betrayal. What are
Yeah.
we creating in these spaces that supports our humans or doesn't support them? And yeah, do we feel like we're going to be retaliated against? Some of that is from our childhood. I know I was trained a certain way and to have certain values placed on myself for certain things that are different than, say, my brother had placed on him, the gender difference,
Mhm.
cultural pieces that are in there, different for me versus a white woman, or different for me versus a darker skinned woman, even of my own race and ethnicity
Mhm.
coming in, and what is also happening in the space itself. I should not have to feel the pressure to disclose that, but is
Yeah.
space safe? Is the space psychologically safe? Can it become that way? And when I talk about when we talk about psychological safety, it's that sense of, can I make a mistake and
Yeah.
not be fired or exponentially negatively impacted compared to other people? Um,
Mhm.
us right up against, racial identities and intersectional identities in the workplace. So I think I'm rambling, but the point being that, like, we shouldn't have to disclose, but
Yeah.
or and the childhood experiences that we have that we might still be experiencing in our adulthood have shaped us. It's how we engage, and we have this in our workplaces too. You can take all those ACE indicators.
Questions. Yeah.
Yeah, fun.
Yeah. Well, as you were saying that, you were like giving examples, and it literally brought me back to probably, 12 years ago. working for a large nonprofit organization in Seattle where, at multiple fundraisers, older donors had, right, like grabbed my butt or, touched me in a way that was really uncomfortable. And when I brought it up to, um, the head of like development, right, philanthropy, his response was like, well, just take one for the team, right? They're one of our biggest check writers, so we're obviously not going to talk with them about it. And I think, and I can still, I can still pull up that memory of being asked to just take one for the team. And there's a lot of that happens. And I think that, the whole Me Too movement has come out of, when women report abuse in the workplace, they're just asked to mind their own business. And if they're not minding their own business, then they get fired. Typically, right? Unless they work in a big company and then they might get moved to a different team or, right, a different department. But by and large, the consequence is getting fired. And I think that term that you mentioned, institutional betrayal, is it's not one that I had actually heard of until I started doing a bit of research for our conversation.
Research in this. Mm-hmm.
Right? And I'm like, how do we not have this language? Why is this language not commonplace? Because, the researcher and author describes it as something like that occurs when an institution, right, and or your boss that you trust and depend on, that they mistreat you. And it can be both deliberate, which I think is, it can often be deliberate, but also like arising from a failure to act. And that piece,
action. Mm-hmm.
the betrayal, and I think the trauma that comes from the failure to act. It really struck with me. If I was like reading this on paper, I probably would have underlined it and like used my like bright pink highlighter on, as well as from failing to act when action is expected. So when you are working with organizations now, with adults, how are you addressing both the deliberate actions as well as failure to act, which can be seen as like making a big deal out of something that's not real?
Oh my gosh. Okay. There's so many things in that. I think butting up against, and we're not going to go into this, but the words you just said butted up so strongly against the nonprofit industrial complex. Again, back with racialized capitalism, sexism, just all of the things, and really thinking about disenfranchised trauma, who gets hurt and why is their pain legitimized or delegitimized, and thinking about who's in power and who gets to determine legitimate pain or not, right? Or what is it? So there's so much in there. So what I want to do is maybe give a metaphor, because I love thinking in mental models. For me, I talk with my clients a lot about, do you knit or crochet or anything? Just out of curiosity. If you do.
I have been known to knit.
Okay, excellent.
But never publicly. I'm like not the person that's coming to like a book club with my knitting bag.
That's all it is. You just have to have some experience with yarn, because yarn gets tangled, right? When it gets tangled, you can keep pulling on it and you can keep making your booties or your sweaters, something like that. But eventually, if you don't take the time to actually untangle the yarn, lay it out, roll it back up, you're going to get to a point where everything is so tightly knotted that you can pull and pull and it's not going to make anything more, or it'll break, right? I think of a lot of the workplaces that I am so fortunate to work with and honored that they bring me in. They're like this, right? We are like this. We have these experiences. that because we're not taking the time to, when it's just a little knot, we're not unwrapping. Instead, we just keep pulling and pulling and pulling. And so when microaggressions happen, they build. When, the thinking about like appropriation of pain, like how organizations, historically white-led organizations are putting out so many things on Juneteenth and, better, but is that doing anything about it, or is that a form of institutional betrayal because they're words, they're not actually getting to the heart that so many of their employees are actually feeling, or their community has felt, their clients even. So we keep pulling and we're like doing it in the name of creating the product, right? But eventually it gets to a spot where there's a break, and that could be a person leaving, it could be people getting fired, it could be just. So what I want to do when I work with clients is help them pause, breathe, right? Come together, and we have to reestablish. We have to understand what trust is. We have to do a lot of clarifying, like teasing this thing apart. What are we coming together for? Why are we investing to come together? What have we risked so far? And really laying it out. So defining things like what is trauma, what is abuse, what is misunderstanding, what is contradiction, what is conflict. And I want to do a big shout out to this book right here, We Will Not Cancel.
Ooh, I love this book. Yes.
Murray Brown, all of their work, all of it, including this book, Holding Change. These pieces are so important for us. Give another his work on accountability and apologizing, basic things that we assume people have, but with assumption, we know all the problems with assumption. We default to white supremacy culture if we do not take the time to tease these things apart. And the really great thing about taking the time to tease them apart, to understand them, to clarify them, is the process of doing that untangling work does help build more trust and interpersonal relationship health. As we do that, we lay it out, and then we're at a point where we can start rolling it up in order to create the, weaving or the set of booties or whatever it is, the tapestry that we want to create. Right? And it's a much more sustainable, forward thinking process rather than the immediate short term. It's long term, and it's investing. So that's a really pretty metaphor, but what that looks like is a lot of perceived discomfort in the moment. There is that can come up. It's slow, right?
Yes.
It goes slow.
Yes.
Incremental steps towards urgent goals. So it's not to say that we're centering those that are most privileged in this space to their comfort, but actually thinking about how do we do this in a way that pushes people and also allows folks that have the experienced trauma to engage at their rate as well. So how do we build these places together? We have to invest in them. And I think one of your questions before was, when you and I were talking, or maybe it was in the email, how do we get started on this, right? You have to, it's the same thing for DEIJ work. You have to invest. You absolutely have to prioritize it, both in your budget, but then also in your goals. In a psychologically safe workspace important to you. Why? Explain why. How are you going to support that with both the direct expenses of bringing in a facilitator, but also the indirect expenses of staff time? What are you going to take off of staff plates so that they can do this work? And how does that impact your previously stated goals, right? How do we make KPI, right?
Okay, hold the thought on KPIs, because that is a favorite topic of mine, and we can have a total runaway situation on metrics. Love me some metrics. I want to actually go back for a second, and you said two things that I want to make sure that we don't lose. One is who gets to experience legitimate pain. And I think that if we live and work in the United States, the answer is I mean, it's white folks, right? Like, which is why when there is perceived discomfort in tackling workplace equity issues, and that discomfort is being experienced by white-bodied people, we pause it.
Right.
We pause it, right? The second thing is, I think that you kind of hinted at, like, is sort of like marketing things like Juneteenth without actually doing anything, like a form of institutional betrayal. And I think a lot, especially around the needs of Black and Brown employees, but Black and Native folks specifically, just given the racialized nature of like life in these United States. And I think very recently, white women experienced institutional betrayal in that most organizations didn't say a damn thing when Roe was overturned,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think I saw for the very, very first time in my career the angst, the anger, the frustration, the I can't respond to emails or be in meetings because I'm so distressed, right? That Friday when it came out, it was like people shut down. White women in particular were like, how could this be? And I'm like, well, how could this not be? Like, this is a form of institutional betrayal. You get to experience it personally, right, as a result of your organizations not saying or not doing anything. And in fact, even the universe of organizations that came out and said that they would either support their employees or provide, reimbursements, etc., that universe is very small. Of the hundreds of thousands of employer, it was maybe a few dozen that stood up. And so with that, I guess I'm just, I'm thinking about the trauma and the stress experienced specifically by Black folks, by Native folks, and by, other communities of color, queer folks. And there's a term that I've heard, that I definitely had heard of before, but I never really dug into it, which is toxic stress,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's this idea that um, you're experiencing stress for a prolonged period of time, and your body never actually has time to recover because you keep getting traumatized and stressed, and you just get stuck in the cycle. But in a more recent, right, this weekend when I was reading up on this, what struck out to me is not just that toxic stress, it was, like, is coming from the stress response and your body doesn't have a chance to slow down, but that there is also a lack of support and
Mm-hmm.
reassurance and like emotional care.
Acknowledgement of it, right? And it's almost like,
Yeah.
even if there is acknowledgement, often it's from this, well, we need to be objective about it, just share it so that we can learn from it, right? And that is really painful. It's another kind of appropriation of trauma and pain. And that
Mhm.
lingering trauma over time, which can intersect obviously with the big T trauma, it is so critical. I want to point out that you and I are two non-Black, non-Indigenous women
Yeah,
that are
that's
talking
right.
about this. So I
Yeah.
think it warrants its own separate conversation with people
Mhm.
personally impacted by the systemic racialized violence and
Yeah.
racialized aggression in our workplaces even. I think that's a really important thing. And when we're looking at, okay, when we have these experiences as closer in proximity to whiteness, where we're
Yeah.
directly impacted, can we dig deep in the well of empathy?
Mhm.
And I think that's the thing about a trauma
Yeah.
informed or even just a trauma aware workplace is the acknowledgement that we hurt, that we have pain, right? The acknowledgement that this influences who I am, and it could be even happening in this space. This is not something,
Mhm.
I think it's always like something that individuals are bringing in. It happens in the space, just like you said, right? I have multiple clients that fit this particular profile that I'm about to share, but so hopefully it resonates with other folks too. But just think about, like you said, 12 years ago, in a very toxic workspace, often coupled with power, whether
Mm-hmm.
from racial identity or gender identities, but also positional power, where that toxicity has more impact, right? It's not just this
Yeah.
person, but it's this toxic culture that is then
Mm-hmm.
forced to work within it. It's your paycheck. I think that's really important to remember how many
Yeah.
are reliant on that. It's your health insurance, which separate conversation we should have.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Those kinds of things, you're in it. I have clients that they've been in that for 10, 20 years before
Yeah.
that changes, where individuals are pitted against each other, where you have, like the golden child and the devil child, and
Yeah.
have all of these same abusive dynamics that are present in the workplace. And then for whatever reason, maybe that person got fired, hopefully, maybe that person
Mm-hmm.
got a promotion, moved away, God knows what happens, right?
Mm-hmm.
If there's like even a wipeout of like the entire senior leadership or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
there are so many opportunities that we need to address it. But often what
Yeah.
happens is a new person is brought in, and it's just expected that you create the widgets. Okay, we got this new person in, that was the issue, not recognizing that you have trauma where
Mm-hmm.
that manifestation internally, the emotional and psychological response to 20 years of a toxic layering little t abuse. And it's
Yeah.
based on intersectional identities in that organization and proximity to power within that organization. And so then we have Aparna and Sapna that are working in this space. Sapna was the golden child to that toxic person. Aparna was the, devil child to that person. We have beef between us. Right?
Yeah.
And then we're just
That's right.
person, and we're not addressing the fact that you and I have stuff. Just because that person is gone doesn't mean that our interpersonal relationship
Mm-hmm.
healed. So are we going to invest in our healing, our understanding of each other's perspectives, taking a step back and looking at the macro picture that happened?
Yeah.
Because all you're doing in that situation when you put a new person in, oftentimes, if it's a woke board, they're putting in a woman of color.
Yeah.
We can talk about the glass cliff,
Yeah. That's right.
but that's setting up for failure as opposed to setting up for success for all parties. And we wonder,
Mm.
why is there still toxicity here when that person is gone? They have a legacy. It's there.
Yeah.
So we have to change the culture. And that takes that intentional work, understanding the words. Use your words, Johnny. I don't know if my word means the same as your word. What is the reality that we're waking up from these different matrices, right?
Mm-hmm.
Version of reality of what happened in this org you do. Can we share them? Is there a way to talk about this? That will help your widget development in the long run way more than just shoving a new person in and just fingers crossed, hopefully the widgets come out good. It's like, how do we bring empathy, compassion, and humanity back into our workplaces?
Oh, yeah. Yes, I want that. I want that. So you've talked about acknowledgement quite a bit, right? And the article that you shared, right, with our audience, it's such a great one because it offers us some language. And what I love even more is that the author sort of, I don't want to say waters it down, but simplifies it. She simplifies it further. She says, a trauma-informed approach. The CDC has sort of 6 tenets, but she boils the ocean and she says the first one is acknowledgement, like I will be heard. It will be addressed. We're not going to brush it under the carpet. And then she says that I can get the help I need, which is support. And that looks lots of different ways for lots of different companies. But it's an acknowledgement that, yeah, we're not going to just ask you to keep coming into work if you have COVID, if like we've acknowledged that this is like a big health situation, you get to take time off. And then trust, which is I will be treated fairly. So I'm not going to get fired if I take my PTO to take care of my health, or if I take my sick leave to take care of my health.
Right.
Yeah. And, you know, in reading and prepping for our conversation, it really struck me as like when it comes to DEI, J, and we don't use J at Moving Beyond because we're not doing that work. We're doing baby steps. Like we're maybe doing aspirational equity, you know. There's a lot of like yes, but.
Mm.
There's a lot of yes, but.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, you can take time off when you need it, but the widget is still due on X date, right? The widget needs to be shipped on X date. It's, yes, like we would love for you to be vulnerable, but not too vulnerable.
Right. I think the but part is actually in parentheses too, because it's often not said. If it was
Yeah.
said, at least you have clarity.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yes, form a DEIJ team or DEI team. Yes, we want you to bring your whole self to work. Yes, we want you to trust and have good conversations. But this is going to be on your own time. But this is still within your full-time job description. But if you
Mhm.
you're going to have to go through a process that forces you as the reporter to educate the reportee, you know, the person that you're reporting. Like that's
Yeah.
the kind of stuff. There's so much implied. And I
Yeah.
think the acknowledgement is one thing. Yes, I see the pain. I see the challenge. I see the dysfunction that's happening here. But we are in such a conflict averse culture, just avoidant, averse, whatever words you want to use.
Mm-hmm.
The processes to even identify it, right? And so we're not willing to get into those uncomfortable spaces. Excuse me.
Yeah.
Mostly folks in power are not willing to get into those uncomfortable spaces. So we defer to the comfort of power. And then we have to have the conversation, if we can, about the difference between discomfort and fragility. When do those
Yeah.
against each other? And so discomfort for growth versus fragility of
Mm-hmm.
away from growth, right? And so that kind
Yeah.
of, sorry to interrupt, but that parenthesis there of like what's not said makes it even harder because you end up with that kind of organizational distrust, right?
Yeah.
Betrayal because
Yeah.
but you said this,
Mm-hmm.
didn't say this thing, but it's implied.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I feel like we can talk about this for the rest of the day. But I know that we're a little over our time, and I just, you know, in in closing, if if you can give us one or 2 points, how do we get started, right? Like the yarn that's knotted up that we know we need to untangle if we're going to continue creating, crocheting, building, right? What does that look like tactically for organizations? What are one or two things you would have people consider?
Mm-hmm. So if I'm talking to organizational leaders, the people in power, especially those that control the purse strings and the direction, prioritize it. I already mentioned this before, but it has to be in your values. If you don't have values stated, y'all need to get your stuff together. You need to have that conversation. What do you value? Because if you don't have your values stated, you're going to default to white supremacy values and racialized capitalism,
Mm-hmm.
money, right? And that's
Mm-hmm.
profits and nonprofits. It's not in anything. So state your values, make sure where are you addressing DEI, where are you addressing health and healing and
Mm-hmm.
empathy in your organization. The next thing would be in your budget. I already mentioned not just direct expenses, but also
Yeah.
time for staff to do this and removing work from their plates, which then gets it prioritized in your goals. So
Yeah.
if it doesn't show up in those three places, you're asking your team, your staff to do work essentially on their own time in many different ways, right? And to me, that just expresses the value of exploitation. So I don't like that. I think those are the biggest things is like prioritize it in those 3 areas and get a facilitator. Like, I'm not trying to pitch out there for me. There's many of us that do this work. The idea is if you are experiencing this, if you are in it, if you are unintentionally the cause of it, you need someone who's a third party who can get and can help guide you. And then I would say the last thing is that leadership needs to lead. They need to be in it. This can't be something you're doing for those poor people that are experiencing trauma. It's much more about like, what is my role in this? Same thing with DEI work, right? If white folks and people in power in the organization can't explain why diversity, equity, and inclusion is important to white people, you saviorism space, and you need to get into co-liberation. So where are we getting in for leadership needing to lead here? How are they demonstrating their commitment and understanding of why a psychologically safe work culture is critical for them, right? It's critical for all of us. How do we do this so that it's liberatory? I would say those are the big pieces. If you are not in a leadership position, or if you are not holding the purse strings, I'd say there are some really great support resources that you can find. There are there are groups to support you. There's resources like readings, podcasts, things to at least make you more trauma aware and even recognize you're not alone. I think that's such a big piece. Even if the organization that you work for, the leaders that you work for aren't going to acknowledge it for you or be with you in it, at least someone can acknowledge. And it makes a huge difference that way. So those would be the 2 different audiences that I would speak to on that.
Okay. Sounds like people need to slow work down a little bit. So that they can actually implement your recommendations, right? And they can't be implemented at the breakneck speed at which we are expected to perform.
Right. And also rethink what we define as work. This is work. This is so hard.
This is work.
This is work. And if we don't see it as work, if we think of it as something extra, it's not going to get prioritized. We need the KPIs around this, right? And that your data work, which I'm sad that we didn't get to, but future.
The data work. Sapna, thank you so much for joining me Monday morning. And I'm excited to, continue spreading the gospel of like trauma-informed workplaces, but specifically that lens in the DEIJ work.
For sure.
Thank you. And we'll be back next week on Monday at 10 o'clock. And we're going to be actually building on some of what you've done in talking about language for cultural competence in the workplace. We all need to be able to speak the same language. So thank you. Have a great week ahead, everybody.